Do you remember your first museum visit? Or a time when you felt inspired walking around a museum? What if you had the chance to help give someone their best ever museum memory? Well, now you do. The National Gallery of Art is recruiting for 2 volunteer opportunities this fall to be one of the friendly faces behind their information desks and the guides who lead their school tours. The National Gallery is hosting information sessions throughout the fall, and they hope you'll join them to learn more and apply. Visit nga.gov/volunteer for more information. That's nga.gov/volunteer.
Today on CityCast DC, the House Oversight Committee actually agreed to something, and that was to possibly bring the Washington Commanders back to the old RFK Stadium site. The legislation would give DC a 99-year lease on the site with fewer restrictions on how it can be redeveloped. It could be just a stadium, it could be just a neighborhood, it could be a little bit of both. The Washington Post's Sam Fortier chatted with us a few months ago about what that land could mean for the team's future and the city's. Today is Thursday, October 5th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Sam, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. I appreciate it.
So James Comer, a member of Congress, has introduced legislation that would maybe possibly give the old RFK site back to the Commanders. What's in this legislation? Why is it happening now?
Yeah, so basically, we don't know the exact specifics of this legislation, but it is legislation that would be, as we understand it, a lease modification and extension to give control of RFK back to the city. Right now, it's owned by the Department of Interior, managed by the National Park Service. And so that's sort of not allowed them to do much development. There's a couple soccer fields over there, but mostly it's just the rusty bucket RFK Stadium that DC once knew and loved pretty well. So why now? Obviously, the city has tried over and over again to get the site back. And they've been unsuccessful for a bunch of reasons. Last year, they tried policy riders on larger pieces of legislation. Muriel Bowser has been a strong champion for the Commanders to return to that site. So obviously, I think you're seeing the mayor circumvent Eleanor Holmes Norton, the representative, and go to the Hill and say, House Republicans, will you work with me? And James Comer has raised his hand and said, yes, I will help you.
So in theory, though, this bill just transfers control to the city. It doesn't say anything about whether the city should put a stadium there or housing or a shopping mall or whatever else you could do.
Yeah, and I want to be very clear that there are 2 avenues for DC to, quote unquote, gain more control. And this is not a land transfer. A land transfer, which would give DC ownership of the site, was going to be a much bigger ask. So right now you're seeing a lease modification and extension. And that's important because right now the federal government is leasing the land to DC. And the lease right now only runs through 2038. And the land usage is restricted to sports, entertainment, and recreation. And so theoretically, you could build an NFL stadium on it right now, but no NFL owner would do it when the term is only until 2038. You need a much longer runway for that. So basically what this legislation will do, and one person told me that the thing that's being entertained right now is they're going to do a 99-year extension and that they're going to take away all the restrictions. So in the NFL, it's very important to NFL owners that their new stadiums are no longer the anchor of a sea of parking lot, right? So instead, what you're hoping to see is it as an anchor of a mixed-use development. So even though DC won't own the land, they'll probably try to do rental housing. They'll probably try to do retail, hotels. I think that their ideal would be to do for the RFK site what Nats Park did for the Capitol Riverfront and sort of, energize that area economically.
So what you're saying, though, is that the legislation would likely change the rules so that the city wouldn't have to put a stadium at all or wouldn't have to have sports uses at all, whatever it wanted with the space.
Exactly. They could do only housing. They could do a bunch of different things. But given the way that this has transpired, Muriel Bowser going to James Comer, I think that there is a pretty good understanding that this is ultimately for the Washington Commanders.
Right. No, we know what Bowser wants, and I have a feeling what members of Congress who get involved in things like this want is the thing that the larger businesses prefer. But there's kind of two issues here. One is, should this football team get a new stadium? Should it move out of Landover? Should it move to Washington or some other place? And then the second issue, the kind of local politics issue, is putting a football stadium on that site the best thing for DC? Let's talk about the team first. Why do they want out of Landover?
The stadium sucks. To be very blunt, it was
built. It's only been like 25 years or 30 years or something.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable because basically when Jack Kent Cooke, the former owner, when he and the DC Council ultimately disagreed and he decided to move out to Landover, he wanted to build it. He was going through some health complications. He ended up dying. And so he wanted this stadium to be done quickly and he wanted it to be massive because, in the year 2000, this team was, according to Forbes, the most viable sports franchise in the world. Obviously, everyone in the region knows how massive it was. And so he was concentrated on putting up something cheaply, quickly, massive. And so I think a really good contrast for this is the Baltimore Ravens, their stadium, M&T Stadium, is pretty much the same age and it's held up much better. FedEx Field has had an array of complications. The first year that I was covering the team, there was some liquid that leaked on fans. Fans say it was sewage. The team says it was a water main. A couple years ago, some fans were going down to celebrate the Eagles win in Washington, which there's been a lot of problems with, opposing crowds as the team has disintegrated. But the railing of the stadium fell and it almost fell on the quarterback of the Eagles. So there's just been a lot of embarrassing moments. Some people inside the team even refer to the stadium as like an old used car that you have to fix up. So They're desperate to get out of Landover for sure.
Right. When Jack Kent Cooke built that stadium, they treated him like a hero because he paid for it himself. But I guess you get what you pay for. So they want out of this stadium, or they want to not be driving around in a used car. Can they fix it, or could they do what they want to do by staying in Landover?
I think it's possible. I don't think that you could take the current structure of FedEx Field and make it do what you want. I think that the upgrades are too steep. The infrastructure is too poor. Right now, I would say that FedEx is definitely a bottom three, probably maybe the worst stadium in the NFL. And so I think that they're looking for a clean start. One option is basically to go across the parking lot because the new owner is going to own roughly 200 acres at that FedEx site basically in Maryland. And so he could go and say, hey, I'm going to do FedEx 2.0 across the parking lot. But I think that just in terms of a location, in terms of separating themselves from the Ravens, I think that there would be a desire to move to either Virginia or DC.
All right, it's Mike here. If you have been listening to this podcast since the beginning, you've heard me talk about Car Care to Go before. Well, they just changed their name to Roda, R-O-D-A, but it is still the same great service. It's made exactly for folks like me who forget about an oil change until the blinking light reminds them, and then forget about it again after I go to the local garage and find out that they're busy. Roda simplifies all that. You make an appointment, they pick up your ride, and they bring it back a few hours later with the oil changed, the wipers replaced, or any of the other hundreds of services they offer completed. I got a freebie the first time, but the price is pretty good even without it. They're accessible all over DC, and their work is covered by a great warranty to give you peace of mind. Instead of sitting in a waiting room drinking bad coffee, why not sit at home and drink your own coffee while they do the work? Get your first oil change for just $20.23. That's 2023, get it? With the code HEYDC20. That's HEYDC20. Sign up at roda.com, that's RODA.com, with the code HEYDC20. So, just putting on your NFL reporter hat, what's the broader trend here? Like, we know that in baseball, with 81 home games a year and the basketball, hockey arenas, the trend had been to move into the center of city to vibrant neighborhoods. Football is a different culture. People drive in, they like to tailgate, they like to do all that stuff. Are teams wanting to be in central cities? Do we have a sense that they would, just because Bowser wants them in RFK, that they would want to be in an urban neighborhood?
So it is tough to tell what the new ownership group wants, because I think that it's important to remember whether it's in an urban area or a suburban area, really what they want is money, and they want the most attractive economic opportunity. And I think that takes a lot of different forms, but mostly the trends I think that you're seeing is that they want the football stadium, because it's not going to be full 81 games a year like a baseball stadium, at the anchor of an economic mixed-use development. And the examples that stick out to me, I think probably the first one was in Foxborough, Massachusetts, where the New England Patriots play.
How far is that from Boston?
I want to say it's about 30 miles, which is definitely one of the larger distances between like a city center and an NFL stadium. Inglewood, the Rams, they're 10 to 15 miles outside of LA, but in each case, you're seeing them build a lot of, if not team controlled, there's definitely just economic opportunity there. And so I imagine that would be key, not just for the new owner coming in to make money, but every time you build a new stadium, every time you do something like that, you boost the valuation of the other NFL teams just by being in an economically advantageous situation, buying up real estate like that. So I think that the new owners would probably like to be at RFK. And I don't even know if that's purely economic, because I do think the fan base of this team has degraded so far in the last 24 years under the ownership of Dan Snyder that being at RFK, which people around the team call the spiritual home of this franchise, I think that would do immeasurable good, and it would really be a fig leaf to the fan base that has suffered through so much for so long.
So, all right, so we know what the team wants, and as you say, money is a big deal. This ownership team has just paid $6 billion with a B dollars, and they're going to want to make some of that back as quickly as they can. The question of what's good for DC, there's an op-ed from Kenyon McDuffie, who's been previously a skeptic, saying he wants the Commanders to return to DC. What's the argument for why we should want this team within the District of Columbia?
The argument for why you would want them, I think, is twofold. One is sort of a baseline civic pride. Hey, this is our team. They used to play here. They should be in our city. Because you have such a wide region here in terms of DC, Maryland, and Virginia, this is the central location. It makes the most sense. And like now that we have a new owner, hopefully putting them in our city center would coincide with a return to glory. Those 80s and 90s Super Bowl years, like that's possible, and we should have them in a central location, and we should be proud to have them here. The other argument, which I think is much more tenuous, is this is a good economic driver for our city. And I think the mayor in particular, she's talked before about, hey, what we did on the Capitol Riverfront, Navy Yard, the wharf, in terms of having Nats Park down there, that was a huge success, and we should do that for Hill East, and RFK would be a big part of that. I think that there is obviously some contention there on both points. Charles Allen, the council member, and others, and Phil Mendelson have said, hey, we need to use this 190-acre site for housing, for other means. There's a lot of sports economists out there who would say the economic argument is tenuous, because when a team pays for a study to say, here's how much economic value we're adding to a region, you have to question the conclusions of that.
And if a baseball stadium brings in people 81 times a year, a football stadium is only going to have 8 or 10 if they make the playoffs. Maybe a Taylor Swift concert every now and then. That's a much smaller benefit. And football fans don't tend to hit the restaurants after a game because they've been tailgating.
Absolutely. I think that it's a totally different culture. And I would say that Nats Park, which is on track to pay off its bonds by 2028, according to the city CFO, that is a major outlier, not just in sports stadiums, but also specifically baseball stadiums, which do have the increased traffic, which you mentioned. So using that as a model, I think it is questionable. But again, I think that you have the civic pride as well. And I think that, in the same way that DC Mayor Tony Williams was the guy who brought baseball back to DC, I think Mayor Bowser, as a legacy component, I think it'd be attractive to her to be the mayor who brought football back into the city.
So for a long time, because Dan Snyder had such a toxic reputation, the move for elected officials was like, hell no, so long as he's there and so long as their name is a racist name, we don't want them here. Those two things are gone. So now we are in a sort of clean slate. What is your sense of the council and the sort of city political opinion about whether in the abstract they want to use that site for a stadium, whether they want the team back? We know what Bowser wants, but as you've said, there's a sort of an opportunity cost argument. This is a huge site. The city is short on housing. We could do something else with it too.
What the council thinks is a major question. And I think one we won't know until push comes to shove, until it's time to really vote. The last major data point that we have is last July in 2022, Charles Allen led a 7-member majority of the 13-member council in terms of sending a letter, I believe, to Eleanor Holmes Norton and saying, we do not want the stadium here. We want to use it for other purposes. And the dynamics of the council have changed. 2 of those members are no longer on the council after elections last fall. And so I think it's much more of an open question. And as you noted, Kenyon McDuffie has come out and sort of become a public champion of the Commanders returning to RFK, which is, I think, very notable because he is the only one, I think, along with Mayor Bowser, who is at least vocally, regularly saying this should happen. And so it's tough, right? Because baseball passed on a 7-6 vote in which 3 of those 7 yeses were lame ducks. And so I think that, like, if you went up to all 13 council members right now and you said, where do you stand? I just don't think that would be a good barometer of what actually could happen push come to shove.
Based on trends and your reporting, what would an RFK site with a football stadium look like?
Basically, what I have to go on here is proposals that have been made in the past. And I think that in an ideal world, you would build the stadium, you would build some level of parking, you have Metro. They would really want it to look like Navy Yard in terms of the football stadium is the anchor. You'd be surrounded by retail and restaurants and apartments. I think affordable apartments particularly would be critical to that proposal. But I do think, going back to this not being a land transfer is a weakness, because if you had a land transfer, at least in terms of the city pitching, hey, this is affordable housing, because if you don't own the land, you cannot sell those properties. So it's going to be rental units at this point. I think the only other thing that we know is that I believe it was the 2022 fiscal budget. They passed a sort of indoor sports complex for $60 million, which I believe would have, a pool and like a track and field athletic facility.
Mm-hmm. Sam Fortier, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, of course. Thank you for having me.
And before you go, here is some quick news. Pepco is paying up for illegally dumping toxic chemicals into the Anacostia River for decades. The electric power company agreed to pay $57 million in a settlement with the D.C. Attorney General's office. Most of that settlement will go towards cleaning up the river. The Attorney General will continue to monitor Pepco to make sure they aren't just passing these costs on to ratepayers. The office also says that the company deserves credit for being the first group to accept formal responsibility for its illegal dumping practices. Also, emergency inspections after a Blue Line train derailed last week have uncovered 32 railcars with bolts that are too loose. All of the 2000 and 3000 series trains, that is 360 railcars, they're the oldest ones in the system, were temporarily removed for emergency inspections. And finally, a shootout outside of The Point, which is a popular restaurant along the waterfront in Southwest D.C. on Monday, led to 3 people being wounded. The man who is now in custody fired at a group of 4 armed men who allegedly tried to steal jewelry from the neck of one of his dinner companions, triggering an exchange of fire. The chaotic scene has left neighbors feeling frustrated and frightened by the continued rise in crime throughout the city. By the way, what do you think of this newscast? Do you listen to it every day? Is it important to you that we keep doing it? We are debating switching things up and want your input. Click the really short multiple choice survey in the show notes to weigh in. Thanks. And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell someone you'd want to go to RFK Stadium with? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.